Welcome to this week's Treasury Career Corner podcast, where I interview Treasury professionals about their Treasury careers. Each and every week, I talk to them about how they've built their careers, where they are now, where they see both themselves and the Treasury profession going to next. Let's get on with the show. In this week's show, delighted to be joined by Maarten Michalides, the Head of Treasury at Enexis Holdings. Enexis is a leading Dutch energy grid operator. But as I say every week on the show, they've been going for over 100 years. Maarten can explain that a little bit more later on in the show. As always, we're going to get straight into it. We're going to take Maarten back to the dim, distant past and how he first ever discovered the wonderful world of, well, you started in finance, but then you discovered the wonderful world of Treasury, sir. So as always, it's your show. Over to you.
So your first question is, how did I get started into finance and Treasury?
Yes.
Well, I started not really in Treasury. I started at KPMG as an audit firm. Actually, I wanted to start at a bank, but it was quite difficult at that time. So I started at the financial services group of KPMG, doing the audit and advisory, mainly for banks and funds. I learned a lot there, but concluded that audit will never be my passion. Yeah. So after 2 years...
What was that? Was it just that it was a good grounding to learn a lot about companies, but you want to do something different? And what was the situation?
Yeah, that's it. I mean, audit is really a specific trade. You need to be skilled and talented. It wasn't really my thing, but it did allow me to visit many different banks and other companies, gain a very interesting insight as let's say, from the perspective of an auditor. Mm. But in my view, it was not really my skill. And what I missed was sort of the commercial action, right, being more in front of things. Then I moved to a bank, the General Bank. That's the predecessor of Fortis Bank. Quickly moved there to corporate banking. Again, I learned a lot there. At a bank, you have the benefit of working with a lot of specialists that sort of work in the same field as you do. Yeah, that if you later on in life work at a corporate, then you can compare, and then you sort of acknowledge the luxury at the bank. Very interesting. Also, good to get a good understanding of how actually a bank works. But over time, I thought, well, again, I need to be even more closer to where things happen. And that brought me to ASML, Treasury of ASML. And they're closer to the origination of transactions, do more fundamental analysis about these transactions.
And so then Maarten, you made the move from corporate banking into Treasury, the wonderful world of Treasury as we know it, and joined ASML. Now, they're obviously a Dutch company, which a lot of the listeners won't know. And what encouraged you to make that move into Treasury? How did you discover it? Or, what was the company? So maybe company and then the role sort of thing. Just maybe explain that for people.
Yeah, ASML is a huge semiconductor equipment manufacturer. Area of lithography. Yeah, it's sort of one of the most key components for making semiconductors. This is a spin-off of Philips. Years ago, sort of over time, they gained a number one, sort of almost monopoly in this area. That is a very, very impressive story. Very capital intensive as well, and requiring a lot of research and development. And of course, it boomed during the internet peak bubble, so to speak. Yeah. That's also when I arrived. Very exciting times. Yeah, I mean, the company first had to invest a lot, and only getting revenues years later, sort of 8 to 10 years later, as the business was still growing. So from a treasury perspective, that's very interesting. And they issued convertibles that carried implied credit spreads of up to 15% back then. Yeah. Today, it's a very strong investment-grade company, but back then, the situation was very different. We were just in a treasury of 5, including the one responsible for insurance. So, as a first position there, it was very exciting. You got to do a lot. I got to focus on, let's say, leasing of the real estate, the FAPs, very specific. Also, the US GAAP element, because the company was listed on NASDAQ, introduced some additional complexity. Focus on the interest rate risk management, on how the cash buffers that the company need to retain. I also did a buyback of convertible bonds. So, sort of the first steps in Treasury. That was a very, very interesting place. The Treasury departments back then were pretty small. As I said, that was, I think, approximately 5. So making a career there after 4 years is a bit difficult, in particular if you want to stay in Treasury. So then a move to a different treasury, different company made a lot of sense.
And I've heard that quite a lot. A lot of the time people sort of say, do people move a lot? I've got Craig who recently joined the team. And when I explained to him that, people will be in a treasury team, and as you say, it might be sort of 4 people, and that you can't really make the move. You can't develop your career, which is sometimes quite frustrating because, treasury in itself is usually quite small, a treasury team. But at the end of the day, it's a key role. But you had to move on, really, didn't you? It wasn't through choice, if that's the right way to put it.
Well, I had to move on to make a career.
Yeah.
It was my choice actually to do that, of course. My choice also to stay within Treasury. Before actually moving on to a different Treasury department, I took a sabbatical for a year. A few years before I met my wife while traveling around the world. Ideal way to actually get to know each other and then to go to a stable marriage thereafter.
Yeah.
When we returned, I was lucky finding a treasury position at Heineken. I said that ASML was more involved in the corporate finance and the risk side. At Heineken, it gave me an opportunity to also get more experience in the operations side. Supported introduction of a new TMS, SAP. Did a lot of work on FX hedge accounting and some other more projects. Heineken back then was also small, so sort of 5 or 6. Today, it's a lot bigger. The company also grew, of course, so that makes sense.
You were sort of still relatively early in your career, but you're now with, as you say, Heineken then was quite different to it is now because it's massive and things like that. But you came in, and I know that at the time you focused on that, getting some systems experience. That was something that you were good at and things like that. Or, what was that role like? Because I know that provided, you went from that to sort of a much more senior role. What did that give you, would you say?
Well, when it came there, they had they were struggling with the FX hedge accounting and all the tools that they had to support it. So I came there there was sort of a crisis concerning that topic. I managed to turn it around with some Excel skills. That's always very convenient as a treasurer to be proficient in Excel. Yeah, from there on, I just grew my position there. Also, based on my experience with ASML and with the bank, did some work on structured finance and some other projects. But then again, when I was there, the strategy was not one of the growth that we've seen in the last years. It was more stable. So staying there didn't really make sense for me. So then, I looked further for a new position.
Yeah.
And Corio came in my path. There I could become a group treasurer. So that was very different industry, but also very capital intensive. Corio doesn't exist anymore. It was a REIT, real estate investment trust. So an investor and manager of shopping malls across Europe. As a treasurer, real estate is really interesting. You quickly get involved both in the business side and the financing side. So this has many features. When I started there, it was just the treasury was just me. When I left 8 years later, I was also responsible for tax, for the corporate forecasting, and total managing a group of sort of 6 or 7 staff. But what I did there is also introduced TMS, but also credit ratings. We issued bonds with quite a few structured finance transactions. The one I remember most was in 2010. It was a very structured CMBS from Italy. Mind you, that's sort of after the financial crisis, and then doing CMBS, we actually took a lot of effort, and I still remember that very well. But it was a success.
And what was it like moving industries? Because you've gone from semiconductors to a brewing company, and then you arrived in real estate. What was it like for you? Because again, you were then growing your team, which I want to dig into in a moment. But you got there. What do you find the challenge of all these different industries, if you like?
What is essential to be successful as a treasurer is to get a thorough understanding of all the risks. Also the business risks and then the financial aspects of those risks. Only if you understand it really well, then you're really seen as the one able and to manage all the risks for the company. So that is sort of vital. I think that should be one of the key skills of a treasurer. I think I have those skills, so it allowed me to quickly understand all the treasury aspects of ASML, of Heineken, and Corio, at least sufficiently to be effective as a treasurer. The differences are, ASML was not really a startup, but really growing, but aggressively growing company, a very international environment, very cyclical. The risk dynamic was completely different than compared to Heineken, which was much more stable Therefore, also the focus at Heineken for me was more on operation than understanding all the risks, financial aspects. But back to Corio again, real estate, it's just collecting rents. Value of the malls are mainly driven by yields, interest rates. So that's really accessible for a treasury. It's easy to have contribute to those processes and to get involved in M&A and all kind of structures. As a treasurer, I really liked that whole company. I think also in a real estate company, it makes more sense for a treasurer to potentially, or it would be easier to become a CFO, for example.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the whole accounting and finance side is much more straightforward than a Heineken process company or an ASML with all the R&D and everything. But as I said, the real estate for treasurer is really nice.
And whilst you were there at Corio, I know that one of the key things, we spoke about this before the show, and things that you grew the team, so you took greater responsibility. What was that like for you? Sort of, you come in as sort of a sole contributor as such, but I know that you built the team, and then at a later stage you took on tax as well. We'll talk about that as a separate challenge. But what was it like? What did you look for when you were looking for people? Again, there'll be people listening today that are going, "Oh, I've got to recruit a treasury manager to work for me, or I've got to recruit a treasury analyst." How did you do it? What was your key to success, if you like, in that sense?
Well, I didn't really have a lot of experience building a team. Unfortunately, I could do it gradually. Of course, you make mistakes, and you also sort of need to accept that you cannot sort of control and influence everything. When I have a job interview, or when I'm the interviewer, when I have a conversation with an applicant, what I appreciate most is if the person already sort of imagines that he or she is already in the role, sort of bridging the distance between, again, the applicant and the interviewer.
Yeah.
And sort of evidencing that you already spent some time thinking how it could be like performing that role. That's not something that you come across often, and particularly with some media and junior positions. So that's a very important criterion for me to look at.
And then you expanded your role, which is quite unusual in a way, because a lot of people are treasury. And I talked to a treasurer the other day about treasury and tax and combining the two things. And the interesting thing was he said, and I won't say who he is, because he said this with respect. He said, the problem with treasury guys, and I know you and I spoke about this a little bit, that the treasury guys simplify stuff too much and tax guys overcomplicate stuff. And he said, that's a broad phrase, and he wasn't being critical of either. What he was saying is that Treasury sometimes, we're going to do this, we're going to move it across there. And the tax goes, hang on, what about the implications of withholding tax there? And you've got to be thinking about this. And he said the flip side is sometimes when you talk to the tax guys, because they're very technically strong, sometimes they go, we'll do this scheme, we'll do this. And he said, look, well, okay, that will save us how much? He said, well, it will save us 100,000. He said, okay, great. How much will it cost us to implement? It's going to cost us 150,000. He said, okay, so we'll stop there, shall we? And they were like, right, yeah. So it's sort of trying to have that end goal in mind. But, with you, when you were then appointed tax as well, and you oversaw that, what was that like for you, in your treasury brain as such?
I did have the benefits that treasury and tax were already closely cooperating. And there were already two experienced tax managers. So they were responsible for the compliance. They know that much better than I do. So there was already a useful, strong basis. I noticed that I could inspire the two tax managers to think sort of further, to sort of think beyond the rules and the structures and the regimes that they're focusing on. And in a read that is very relevant and interesting because, we typically is tax exempt. And we were present in sort of 7 countries, and in a few we were tax exempt, in a few others we were not. So we could do a lot of analysis together, whether it would make sense from both the tax and the treasury angle to also get that status in other countries. Mm. Yeah, I think that cooperation went really well. You have to leave sort of the specialist stuff, the compliance things, really to the tax managers, and sort of find sort of common ground, stuff where you can really build together. And we were able to find that in a read, again, because, it's highly tax driven.
You've moved through these. Sometimes treasury, I talk to treasurers and they might be 20 years in one company, not often, but, sometimes. But you then made a move from real estate to telco. telecoms. What was that like? And, how did you achieve that in your head? What I mean by that is, you've made these moves. You've got everything from, as I said, brewing, then real estate, and then into telecoms before, or recently into energy. So talk us through that, if you went into that move, if you would.
Telco was a big change for me. I mean, I suddenly became part of a treasury department of sort of 130, I think, across the globe, and perhaps 10 or 12 on HQ. Completely different company, completely different dynamic also. For me, that took some time to get used to that. And it also, when I moved, I sort of realized how sort of accustomed and used I got to my previous role. And although I became treasurer, head of tax, and a lot of things changed, you get sort of used to your environment and vice versa. There's sort of stability that is sort of growing. So then when I, after 8 years, came to VEON, and a really quite dynamic company, that was a quite radical change. And for me, that took some time to get used to it. So for myself, soon after I started, I thought, well, was it actually the right step? Yeah, it really took some time for me to realize that I should just stay there and just see how it goes and gradually sort of build my role and grow. I managed, but at the start for myself, it wasn't really so obvious.
Talk me through the role at VEON. You were Director of Treasury and Corporate Finance. Who are VEON, again, for the companies out there?
Yeah, VEON is a telco operating in, let's say, not Western countries, countries like Pakistan, Kazakhstan, Russia, Ukraine, right, and others. Over 200 million active subscribers, so pretty big in terms of subscribers, but in value, of course, less. I mean, when I started, I mainly focused again on forecasting and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. There were many initiatives across VEON, M&A, doing spectrum transactions, selling, how do you call those things, the masts. And it was difficult at HQ level to sort of compare them all. So I actively took a leading role from the Treasury Department to build a model that helped us to compare all these different transactions, at least from a Treasury perspective. That was sort of the basis. And from there on, I also took other roles. Eventually, we drafted the FX strategy. And there was a huge exposure to rubles. Earlier on, I got actively involved in the joint venture with Hutchison in Italy. That was sort of the only Western country where we were present. But later we sold our stake to Hutchison, where I also got involved in widening a huge swap portfolio. Very dynamic, very international, very varied. Yeah, but at some point it was also sort of enough for me. VEON was a bit in a difficult spot. It had some compliance issues. Also, the market was a bit against them. So they decided to cut down at least HQ. Yeah, as part of that, I decided to move to a different role, and that is then Enexis, which is more similar to Corio, smaller size, different challenges.
Explain what Enexis do. Internationals, they'll be like, oh, I don't know them at all. So can you explain for the listeners?
I didn't know them either before I started working there. They're the grid operator in 1/3 of the Netherlands. So in those provinces where I do not live, the regional grid operator. So they're operating the gas and electricity grids. We have approximately 4,700 employees, balance sheet total of 8 billion, 3 billion of debt, mainly bonds. And we're owned by governments, meaning 5 provinces and 88 municipalities. Well, the company used to be a stable grid operator, but now it finds itself in the middle of the energy transition. It has to do a lot of adjustments and expansions to the grid to enable this energy transition to reach the climate goals.
What was the transition like? I know we spoke in our pre-podcast call about this, but the transition from a PLC, private, public company rather, to a privately owned group, and sort of more government owned. What's that been like for you as a treasurer, would you say?
Yeah, of course, a completely different environment. You have to take that into account. In any case, it is always sensible not to too quickly give your opinion about things. Just first to digest things and make sure that you understand, what you need to understand. Didn't really have too much time for that at Enexis because it's also there hitting the ground running. But yeah, there clearly is a kind of cultural change if you're either managed by sort of company that is mainly owned by Russian parties, also listed, has a US angle and everything, or you are owned by provinces, a grid operator needs to be stable. That's different. You need to consider that. At VEON, I think they were sort of dealing with all the change that was happening around them also in the past. And with Enexis, it's more, well, how will we actually deal with all the changes that are coming in our direction? So it's a more positive dynamic.
As you say, you then allude to the green bond framework and things that's like that. What's that been like? Is that a big driver for you guys?
Yeah, for us, that's very important. Through our grids, we, of course, transport green energy. Also, by expanding our grids, we connect new solar parks and wind parks to the grid. So we are really we have a key role in this energy transition. And issuing green bonds, having a very solid ESG rating is very consistent with that.
Green bonds, renewables, all this stuff, it's the watchword. Everyone's, putting it out there saying, oh yeah, this is what we got to do. We're going to be like this and blah, blah, blah. Do you find that it's sometimes maybe frustrating that, other people, you're obviously very much committed to it because that's, the forefront of what you guys do as a company. Do you sometimes think that people are just paying lip service, would you say, outside? Or do you like the fact that everyone's trying to get in on the act sort of thing?
Yeah, I think that's probably partly true. If you want to sort of realize change at the start, perhaps you need to exaggerate a bit. And I think the trend is okay. It's good to support that. And there's also no turning back. So like arguing with the auditor eventually doesn't really make a lot of sense. It's better to find ways how to go along with this change and how to adapt.
You're the head of Treasury. You've got a team of Treasury professionals working with you and things like that. What do you like as a boss? When you're setting out, coaching, managing these guys, what do you like when you've grown teams now? You've become better and better as a manager. What do you like now as you how do you do it?
When I started, it was a team that was there sort of on average already, 10 years and longer. I was the youngest in the team. My age is roughly 50, so that tells you something. Also, Enexis was always very stable, not a lot of changes. It was also to remain stable. So, my challenge was to create a new dynamic in the team, in part in areas where I wasn't really experienced. I'm now also responsible for purchasing the grid losses. But also there, we needed new energy. What I like is if people are sort of self-driven, if they set their own goals, but you can only do that if they sort of understand what the overall company goals are. So I spend a lot of time discussing that with the different team members, make sure that we are all aligned. That still takes time and effort, of course. But to create more dynamic, I also hired 2 younger staff, roughly age 30, 35, and the other I hired last year, actually, initially as an intern, and now he's permanently with us. I created more dynamic within the team. It's only 6, but we have also 6 or 7 topics. I mean, those were given to specific members of the staff, but I created more dynamic there, creating teams. So I think that worked really, really well. But it's a long process, not something that you sort of change within just 1 or 2 years.
And when you're, looking at the future of the group and things like that, as you say, recruiting this team with an eye to the future, where do you see it developing for you guys? And what's the future for future Treasury challenges, if you like? You and I, we used to be able to go to things like conferences. One day we'll be in a real world conference again when they let us out of our houses. But what do you see as the big challenges coming up for Treasury now? You're obviously focusing on the green bonds, which is fantastic, but where are you then moving to in the future?
Currently spending a lot of time making sort of working agreements with other departments. And during COVID, I realized that we need those. When you're in the same office, you find each other on an informal basis, but if you have to find each other on the phone or calls, that's less obvious. So let's create a more formal cooperation structure. I also asked my staff to do that, to reach out to other departments, to write down, working agreements. I think that gets increasingly important also as things only get more complex, and particularly at the HQ level. I think there, Treasury can play a role, but then we need to sort of structure again how we work together with other departments. That is my focus for let's say for the coming years. I think that's a trend that will stay there. So I think that the Treasury will move more from a sort of company that the first department that was responsible for the financing to a department managing projects and again the cooperation between departments.
And how have you encouraged that? I was recently featured on a panel and one of the guys was saying, oh no, Treasury's shrinking. And I think it's total the opposite. I think that Treasury in itself is actually expanding, but I think the difference is that the role of a treasurer and role of the Treasury team is changing, that it's much more, being there at the hub of things and trying to help the tax guys, help the finance, help FP&A if they're doing a project, say, look, we're here to consult and help you and things like that and support those guys. So you're very much more, and you and I have talked about this as well, Maarten, that, you're really there to help the business, whereas in the past it was slightly more ivory towered, give us your cash and we'll look after it and do stuff. How do you encourage that with your team, would you say?
Clearly make them responsible for certain areas, for example, for procurement or for leasing or for the contacts with the planning department. So creating more dynamic there. But as I said earlier, also explain to them how that is all linked to the overall objectives of the company, of the treasury policies, sort of painting the broader picture for everybody. If you do that, if you make people understand, what it is you're after and how they can contribute to a sort of joint success that supports the company, that really works. That really unleashes energy. That's sort of how I approach it.
As the world sort of comes out of the COVID and the pandemic and everything else, where do you see the continued development? We're going to come towards the end of today's show shortly, but, before we do that, where do you see, Treasury adding value? What are you now, as everybody gets back on their feet, if you like, what do you see as next?
What I just mentioned is these kind of formalizing the cooperation with other departments. I think the finance department is very, at least in the companies I've been with, is increasingly busy with automation, ERP systems, and what have you, and managing all the complexity of companies becoming more international. I think that leaves many other topics sort of unaddressed. And I think Treasury has a key role to play there. And the topics differ per company, of course. For us, it is the ESG rating, the leasing, the risk at procurement, and so on. So I think that's a sort of priority when we get back, making our footprint in the company bigger.
Yeah, you're getting out there and really connecting with it. I know that's a key theme. So what we will do, as we said before, we will put your LinkedIn details in the show notes. But as we wrap up today's episode, I know that we talked about maybe some of the tips you've got for the people listening today. What would you say, if someone's listening today and then maybe they're early in their career or, reflecting over your career, what sort of advice would you give to the guys listening today?
What helped me a lot is to change jobs, just get a new position, expose yourself to new things, and learn from them. My tip would be to do that both professionally and private. So also then travel or, I don't know, find out new stuff, read books, get inspired, be creative. That is my tip.
Amazing. There you go, guys. Be creative, and some great tips from Maarten there. So we'll put your details in the show notes, your LinkedIn details. So feel free to connect if, it'd be great to have a stronger network and things like that. Well, thank you, sir. And it was a good, nice and easy one today. Just a nice walk through your career. And I think people will get some good advice from that as well. Yeah.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, sir. Hello, it's Mike here again. I hope you enjoyed this week's show. If you did, then maybe you want to follow the show or subscribe, depending on where you listen, whether that's iTunes, Spotify, or another great place to listen to the show from. It's totally free and means that you'll be the first to see each and every week when we release a new show. And maybe whilst you're there, you could even leave a quick review. Reviews and ratings are among the most important metrics for a podcast to effectively rank. And as you can probably appreciate, the podcast is a lot of hard work to produce every week. It'd be amazing. Just take, say, 20 seconds, leave a quick review of my amazing guests and their great career stories. We'd really appreciate it. Thanks very much, and I can't wait to see you soon.